Hi folks, I wanted to just very briefly introduce you to Luke 10, 1 through 12 and why we're using this text. You're going to be invited to dwell in the Word using the guidelines that will be in the package that you receive. Each time you meet together, whether as a board of the church or a group of the church, when you come together for meetings and conversations, to begin each time dwelling in the Word. And again, Luke 10, 1 through 12 is the text. So let me just give you a very brief introduction to the text, which might help explain why do we choose this text and live in it for a year or so. Luke is part of a 2-volume piece that was written, Luke Acts, together. And it was written somewhere towards the end of the 1st century. And by the time it was written, the early church had really entered a second generation. It obviously had vivid memories of its founding and its development. It could go back to the church in Jerusalem and then in Antioch, and of Paul and Peter and those great missionary journeys and the outflowing and the movement of God. All of that, by the time Luke is writing in probably the late 70s, early 80s of the 1st century, that has become the past and not the present. And the expectation that had been present, that Christ would return very quickly, that Jerusalem and the temple would be the center of the church, that this would be, if you wish, Judaism written big, many of those expectations had somehow failed to come about. And what's going on in these little Gentile house communities spread all over the Roman Empire is that increasingly these young Christians were asking a question. What's gone wrong? How come things haven't turned out the way they expected? And Luke begins to address that, particularly in the book of Acts. But another question that was beginning to percolate and move amongst these people was the question of, well, how do we know what God's up to? We thought that God was about a certain set of things around Jerusalem and the temple and all of the promises of the Old Testament, but Jerusalem has been destroyed and the temple's gone, and that doesn't look like it's going to happen. So how do we know what God's going to be up to? A third question that was percolating through all of that was then a question that asked, and what does it mean to be a church, a local gathering of God's people in this changed context? So the picture you get is that Luke is writing to groups of Christians who had a set of assumptions about who God was, what God was doing, and what the church was to be about. And many of those assumptions had really been challenged and almost taken away from them. And so they were asking in fresh ways, what's God doing? And Luke Acts addresses those three questions in this way. First, in the book of Acts, Luke continues to say, look, nothing's gone wrong. It's just that very quickly we put God in a box. It was a Jerusalem box and a temple box and a Judaism box. But God is up to something bigger than that. And so what the Spirit of God keeps doing is taking the boxes that we create, the boundaries that we create, and say, we've got God right, all we now need to do is market God. And the Spirit keeps breaking that apart in order to keep pulling God's people into a bigger vision of what God is up to. That's the book of Acts. And I think that's what's going on amongst so many of us as churches and denominations today. But the next question is, then, if that's what's happening, how do we know what God's up to? And how do we know what it looks like to be a church? And that brings us to Luke 10, 1 through 12. And here's what I want to propose, just very briefly, and invite you to explore in this as you dwell in this word. Luke answers the question, what is God up to? Or how do we know what God is up to? In Luke 10, 1 through 12, by saying, you'll never know what God is up to simply by staying inside the walls of your churches. What you're going to have to do is take the risk of getting outside your walls and to go into the neighborhoods and communities, the towns and villages where you live, and be willing to enter the homes and sit at the tables of those people and enter their stories and narratives, because somewhere in their stories and narratives are the clues to what God is up to in the world today. So Luke, in many ways, is offering us a way of addressing in our own time the question, how do we know what God is up to? And it has to do with us leaving behind our baggage. That is, how do we get people to come to our church or believe the way we do, and enter the communities to listen. Now that doesn't mean we stop going to church or we give up on church. We need to even more deeply dwell in Scripture and learn. But it's also about this other journey into the neighborhoods and communities. Finally, this question, what does it mean to be a local church today? We thought we had it figured out, but things have changed so much. What does it mean? Luke is inviting us in Luke 10, 1 through 12 to consider this. That the only way we can answer the question, what does it mean to be a local church today, is by going out into the neighborhoods and communities where we live and entering the places where the ordinary men and women all about us live, and entering their lives and listening to their conversations. And only in the process of doing that will we begin to discover what it needs to look like to be a local church in our world today. Now this in many ways is turning upside down the way we tend to approach being church. Too often in my experience, what we do is we take a book off the shelf that somebody's written in some faraway place, or we send a team of people to go and look at a church or a program or a conference somewhere in some other part of the country, and they come back and they get very excited, and we try to copy what's being done elsewhere in other places. And we miss the genius of what God is always about, which is this: creating in the local, in your neighborhood and community, a specific way in which God is working. And therefore, to address the question of what kind of church do we need to be is not first to gather together and to do studies. It's to learn how to go out and to enter into our neighborhoods and to listen and to discern. That's what Luke 10 is all about. And so we want to invite you to spend the rest of this year, each time you come together, opening this text, reading it together, and listening to one another as a process of discernment. And as you do that, and as you begin to learn to enter your neighborhoods and communities and listen to the conversations of people in your communities, Luke 10 will begin to become alive to you in fresh and hopeful ways.